the fields of Japan were soaked not just with rain, but with a century of blood. For 100 years, the sword was the only law, and the harvest was reaped only by the strongest hand. It was the age of the country at war, the Sengoku Jidai, where every road held a bandit and every province sheltered a hungry army. 1,000 lords and 1,000,000 whispers of revolt, each one a blade held near the throat of the emperor. The tear in the land was deep, and it was not clean. Then a figure emerges from the smoke of Sekigahara. Tokugawa Ieyasu. He did not promise a gentle dawn, only a quiet one. He took the shattered pieces of the kingdom and hammered them together on an anvil of absolute will. He forced the great clans to kneel, not with a treaty but with architecture, with distance, and with the threat of total destruction. He gave them peace, a heavy, unyielding peace, forged in iron and sealed behind the towering stone of a new city, a fortress in a damp marsh called Edo. This is the story of how fear became order, the dynasty that locked Japan away from the world and dared the world to look in. The silence they won would last for 260 years. A world frozen in place, defined by a shogun's peace. But behind the gilded screens of Edo Castle, power is never truly still. Secrets linger in the polished wood and the intricate rules of isolation. We move now into the long quiet, the time when a nation learned what it meant to be governed by a dynasty forged in suspicion. The scroll of the Tokugawa Shogunate begins now. The heartbeat of the nation was no longer the ancient court of the emperor. That was a gilded cage, a beautiful symbol with no teeth. True power moved east, away from Kyoto, to a swamp where the wind howled and the sea retreated. Tokugawa Ieyasu did not choose Edo for its beauty. He chose it for its distance from the old ways and its potential for walls. He built a capital designed to manage its enemies. The colossal stone of Edo Castle was more than defense. It was a psychological weapon. Its moats were impossibly wide, its gates labyrinthine, and its sheer, overwhelming size suggested an authority that could not be challenged, only obeyed. The shogun ruled from the center of a spiderweb, and every single road of the land led back to him. The great lords, the daimyō who had fought against him, were allowed to keep their lands, but they were never allowed to keep their freedom. The most ingenious weapon was not a sword, but a schedule. The system was called Sankin Kōtai, the alternate attendants. Every lord was forced to maintain 2 expensive households, one in their remote home province, and one, opulent and under 1,000 watchful eyes, in the shogun's capital. This forced movement was brilliant and cruel. It drained their treasuries with annual, costly processions across the land, limiting the funds they might use for war. But more potent than the expense was the arrangement for their families. When the lord left Edo to govern his domain for a year, his wife and eldest son remained behind. They were not called hostages, but everyone in the land knew what they were. They lived under the shogun's constant, silent surveillance, their very presence guaranteeing the good behavior of their husbands and fathers 100 leagues away. Fear was the true tax, and loyalty was paid in family ties. The price of peace was the fragmentation of the clan. Yet control must extend beyond the restless ambition of the lords to the chaos of the common people. To truly freeze the kingdom, Ieyasu imposed a social stillness. The fluidity of the war years, when a clever peasant could rise to become a warlord, was gone forever. Society was hammered into 4 rigid castes: the samurai, the farmer, the artisan, and the merchant. A man was born into his place, and there he would die. Movement between the castes was almost impossible, a crime against the new order. The samurai, once reckless warriors, were now administrators, keepers of the peace they had helped to create. Their swords became symbols more than tools, polished emblems of a power they rarely used, but a power that remained absolute. For the peasant, the vast majority of the population, life was a cycle of endless labor, chained to the rice field. They were the silent engine of the peace, their harvest fueling the vast machine of Edo. The goal was stasis, a nation where ambition was a dangerous whisper and revolution was unthinkable. The shogunate did not just govern Japan, it defined it. It placed the entire population under a ceiling of polished, oppressive order. This peace, this quiet, would endure because it was built on a foundation of absolute internal control. But one crucial layer of protection remained, one great wall that would seal the shogun's authority against the tides of the world. The long shadow of the Tokugawa dynasty did not end at the shores of the Four Islands. It extended outward across the deep ocean, daring the outside world to try and break the silence. The long shadow of the Tokugawa dynasty did not end at the shores of the Four Islands. It extended outward, across the deep ocean, daring the outside world to try and break the silence. The silence they sought, however, could never be total while the rest of the world was turning. The agents of disturbance were not rival samurai armies or political factions. They were ships, foreign ships. They carried trade goods, yes, silk, sugar, and muskets, but they carried a far more dangerous cargo, a new god, a faith that dared to place spiritual authority above the will of the shogun. For decades, the Portuguese and the Spanish, the first Europeans to arrive in force, had been welcomed. But with them came the Jesuits, and with the Jesuits came conversion. By the time Ieyasu consolidated his power, tens of thousands of Japanese had exchanged the traditional path for the teachings of Christianity. This dual loyalty was an unacceptable crack in the polished ceiling of Tokugawa rule. A single, unified mind was required of the nation, and the spiritual heart of the people had to belong entirely to Edo. The response was methodical, total, and irreversible. A series of edicts were issued, not merely as laws but as a total, national severance. By the year 1635, Japanese citizens were strictly forbidden from traveling abroad. Any who had already left were forbidden to ever return. To violate this was an immediate death sentence. The shogunate did not stop at people. It stopped the ships themselves. Large, ocean-going vessels were banned entirely. All new construction was limited to coastal craft, unable to cross the deep ocean. Japan closed its own door, bolted it shut, and then began to methodically brick up the windows. This was Sakoku, the chained or locked country. It was an intentional, self-imposed exile from the world's currents. To truly seal the land, the foreign presence had to be purged. The great, final, bloody act was the Shimabara Rebellion in 1637. A mass of discontented peasants, many of them Christian converts, rose up against the shogun's authority. The answer was overwhelming. The rebellion was crushed with terrifying, merciless efficiency. 40,000 people died in the final siege. It was the ultimate horrifying proof that the Tokugawa peace had no room for deviation. All Christian symbols were destroyed, all foreign priests expelled. The Portuguese were gone. The Spanish were gone. Only one tiny, calculated sliver of connection remained: the Dutch traders. They were deemed to be motivated by commerce alone, not by the dangerous zeal of the Catholic faith. They were confined to the cramped, artificial island of Deshima, a single pinprick of contact in the harbor of Nagasaki. They were prisoners of trade, allowed to exchange goods and information only under the strictest, most humiliating surveillance. Japan was now a fortress state, frozen in amber. For the next 200 years, the nation existed outside of history. While Europe convulsed through revolutions, while the modern age of industry dawned, and while empires clashed across new continents, Japan slept. The samurai kept their feudal swords. The peasant kept his ancient cycle of labor. The clock stopped at the moment of Ieyasu's triumph. The shogunate had achieved its ultimate goal: perfect, unchanging stasis. The iron peace was absolute, protected by an unbreakable internal control and an impenetrable external barrier. But this radical, national self-imprisonment carried a devastating price. To shield its people from every single dangerous idea, the shogunate had also shielded them from every new technology, every medical advance, and every shift in global power. The Tokugawa state believed it had constructed eternity, but in sealing the gates, they had unknowingly planted the deepest seed of their own destruction. For the enemy that would eventually breach the Great Wall of Isolation would not be a band of priests or a rival army, but the unstoppable, surging force of time itself. The shogunate understood control not just as a political act, but as an architectural one. They didn't just stop the clock of history, they dismantled the gears of society itself, reassembling them into an immutable cage of class and duty. This was the great design of stasis, the four rigid pillars of the Shinokosho, the samurai, the peasant, the artisan, and the merchant. Every life was a pre-assigned note in an ancient, sacred score. The farmer toiled to provide the sacred rice. The artisan crafted the necessary tools. The samurai provided the only service that truly mattered, the enforcement of the peace. And the shogun's authority, the military government known as the bakufu, was the ceiling that pressed down on them all. To move between these ranks was unthinkable. To challenge them was to challenge the natural order of the universe. This was the price of perfect peace, the sacrifice of all individual ambition. But the shogunate's greatest success quickly became its deepest, most insidious wound. What purpose is a professional warrior in an age of perfect, mandatory peace? The samurai, the ruling class of sword-bearers, were suddenly an obsolete muscle in the national body. They had no wars to fight, only stipends to collect. Their stipends, once paid in rice and honor, now required bureaucratic calculation and cruel debt. The warrior was forced to become a paper pusher, a minor official, often having to sell the cherished weapons that defined his entire existence simply to feed his family. He was forced to live on the memory of glory, while his children knew only the quiet desperation of an endless, stagnant present. The samurai were an army designed for a coming conflict that would never arrive, forced to stand guard over the very boredom that was killing their spirit. This internal decay created an enemy far more dangerous than any foreign fleet, a deeply disillusioned and financially ruined ruling class. Yet, as the samurai bled their coffers dry, an invisible economic shift was occurring at the bottom of the pyramid. Look to the despised merchant class, the chonin. By Confucian ideal, they sat at the very last step, creating nothing of true value, only profiting from the labor of others. They were parasites on the body of the state. Yet in the 2 centuries of peace, they amassed all the gold. While the samurai suffered in their noble poverty, the merchants of Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto became the true financial masters of the nation. They were despised and regulated with severity, but they held the purse strings. They funded the new world of the city, bankrolling the feudal lords whose wealth was now tied up in the old ways of rice. The shogunate had outlawed social change, but the invisible, relentless force of capital was already rewriting the social contract from below. And this urban wealth fueled an extraordinary, feverish cultural explosion. Confined physically by the national walls, the energy of the people went inward. In the great sprawling cities, a new, vibrant, often hedonistic life flourished. This was the ukiyo, the floating world, a space for pleasure, theater, and fleeting beauty. The art of ukiyo-e captured it all. The celebrity actors of kabuki, the courtesans of the pleasure districts, the defiant, momentary joy of a life lived intensely between ancient, crushing rules. It was the steam released from the pressure cooker, a beautiful, brilliant defiance that masked a deeper, dangerous frustration. While the shogun focused obsessively on internal stability, the world outside the barrier did not sleep. The force of time, ignored for so long, was beginning to manifest as smoke on the horizon. From the 1820s, the unsettling sightings began. Unfamiliar ships built of iron, powered by an impossible black fuel, moving against the wind and the tide. They were not Dutch, and they did not ask politely for trade. They were the vanguard of a new, aggressive, industrial age of empires. Each sighting was a whisper of dread, a crack in the iron wall of isolation. The shogunate called them the Kurifune, the black ships, the dark messengers of an unavoidable future. The 200-year sleep was about to be interrupted, not by a gentle awakening, but by a deafening, terrifying intrusion. The Iron Peace was about to meet the ironclad. The 4 vessels that anchored in the summer of 1853 were an impossible question delivered at cannon point. They sat like monsters in Uraga Bay, their paddle wheels churning the waters that had been the exclusive domain of small, approved Japanese and Dutch ships for centuries. Their engines roared, not with sails and wind, but with an internal, terrifying violence. The sound of the steam whistle was the sound of 200 years of enforced silence instantly shattered. The shogunate had relied on geography. It had built its entire political reality upon the vast, insulating distance of the ocean. Now, distance was meaningless. The great wall of the sea had been breached, not by an invading army, but by 4 ships carrying nothing but an envelope. For 200 years, every official decree, every ritual, every law was about control, silence, and internal order. Now, a frantic, paralyzing chaos seized the halls of power in Edo. The government, known as the Bakufu, was designed to manage stagnation, to perfect stillness. It had no mechanism, no protocol for speed, aggression, or the sudden, unanswerable challenge of the industrialized world. The man who delivered the ultimatum was an American, Commodore Matthew Perry. His mission was not diplomacy. It was coercion, polite and terrifying. His ships were black, their hulls iron, their guns silent, but their presence spoke with the volume of 1,000 naval broadsides. Perry was methodical and calm. A representative of a foreign empire that understood power not as an ethereal mandate from heaven, but as a measure of coal burned per hour. He presented the documents, written in an incomprehensible, spidery hand, laying out an ultimatum for the secluded nation. The demands were simple but impossible: open ports for trade, coal and water, formal recognition of the West, and the negotiation of binding treaties. To accept meant the end of the Iron Peace, the erosion of the Tokugawa law, and the welcoming of foreign pollution. To refuse meant immediate war with a power they could not hope to comprehend, let alone defeat. The chief elder, Lord Abe Masahiro, and the entire council were trapped. Their military doctrine rested on honor and the ancestral sword. Their enemy, rested on clockwork and explosive shells. After delivering the letter, Perry did not wait for an answer. He surveyed the land, made a chilling show of force, and then simply sailed away. But the departure was not a retreat. It was a promise, calculated to maximize fear. He stated plainly he would return in 1 year, and he expected the Tokugawa shogun to have an answer ready. The departure of the black ships left behind a devastating wake of political and spiritual destruction. The Kurifune had not just anchored in the water. They had anchored a deep, cold dread right into the Japanese soul. The shogun's authority, the very foundation of his rule for 2 centuries, rested entirely on his ability to protect the nation and keep the land pure, stable, and isolated. That purity was now sullied by American coal dust and the undeniable fact of foreign steel. The crisis was no longer about foreign trade or treaties. It was a crisis of legitimacy. The terrifying silence of the following year was deafening. Every official knew that when the smoke appeared on the horizon again, it would bring an end to an age. A dangerous, forbidden question began to circulate in the daimyō estates and the samurai barracks. If the Tokugawa government could not defend the nation, why should it continue to rule? The Iron Peace, imposed with such brutal efficiency, had created its own internal weaknesses. The 200 years of internal focus meant the samurai class, restless and largely ceremonial, still held the spirit of command. Now their ancient purpose was suddenly reawakened. The black ships, intended by the West to open Japan to global trade, instead opened a chasm right through the heart of the rigid 200-year-old peace. The storm was coming, but this time it was rising not from the sea, but from the land itself. The loyalties were about to shift. And the Tokugawa dynasty was about to learn that sometimes the greatest threat to a ruling house comes not from the foreigner outside, but from the men inside the wall. The loyalties were about to shift. And the Tokugawa dynasty was about to learn that sometimes the greatest threat to a ruling house comes not from the foreigner outside, but from the men inside the wall. The tremors began not in the grand hall of the shogun's Edo castle, but in the forgotten, shadowed halls of Kyoto. For 2 centuries, Kyoto had been the gilded cage of the emperor, a figurehead of divine lineage but zero political power. The Tokugawa had deliberately neutralized the imperial court, reducing it to a ceremonial relic. But a relic is still holy, and a holy man can be weaponized. The disaffected samurai, the shishi or men of high purpose, needed a banner, a justification that transcended mere rebellion. They found it in the concept of Sano Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. It was a simple, perfect cry that allowed them to be both deeply traditional and violently revolutionary. The legitimacy they stripped from the shogun, they gave instantly to the emperor. The power of Japan began to seep away from the cold, clinical efficiency of the Tokugawa bureaucracy, and flowed toward the ancient, spiritual authority of the imperial palace. This was the opening the outer domains had waited 200 years for. The great Tazama lords of the West, Satsuma and Choshu, had been forced into submission by Ieyasu generations ago. They were forbidden from holding any positions of power, treated as permanent outsiders. Now, they saw their chance to finish the war that was never truly concluded. These domains, geographically distant and militarily proud, began to secretly modernize, pouring their wealth into Western rifles and European cannons. While the shogun clung to the samurai code of honor and tradition, his enemies were arming themselves with the weapons of the foreign devil they publicly vowed to expel. The Iron Peace dissolved into a terrifying shadow war. The streets of Kyoto and Edo, once the safest cities in the world, grew slick with the blood of magistrates and foreign envoys. The shishi moved like ghosts, their swords striking out at any symbol of the Tokugawa policy of accommodation. The shogun's administrators were dying in their beds or ambushed on the road, decapitated one loyal servant at a time. The government was being paralyzed by terror. The shogun, stripped of legitimacy and surrounded by enemies both visible and hidden, was caught in an impossible vice. He could not expel the barbarians without inviting total war, but he could not tolerate them without inviting total revolution. Any action he took would be seen by the shishi as a sign of his weakness, or worse, his treason. The Tokugawa government, the Bakufu, tried to claw back control. They launched brutal purges against the dissidents, sending special police units to arrest and execute the most outspoken revolutionaries. They were too slow. The structure built for stability and stagnation was incapable of acting with the necessary speed. The men of Satsuma and Choshu, seeing the government weaken and their own support grow, finally cast aside all pretense. They took the final, irrevocable step. In late 1867, under the emperor's supposed authority, the rebel leaders declared the Tokugawa Shogunate formally abolished. They declared that the 200-year military rule was over, and that all political authority was restored to the imperial court. It was a complete, bloodless coup d'etat against the history of Japan. The shogun's reaction was slow but devastating. He could not accept this. To allow the declaration to stand was to accept the total collapse of his dynasty, his family, and the peace they had forged. The only response was war. The final moment of decision had arrived. The shogun would now be forced to march his armies on Kyoto, the imperial city. He would either defeat the rebels and re-establish his right to rule by the sword, or he would become a sworn enemy of the emperor. In the first weeks of 1868, the great armies of the East, loyal to the shogun, began to march toward the capital. They were met by the modernized forces of the West, armed with repeating rifles and the promise of a new age. The Iron Peace was over. The war was no longer against the foreign powers, it was against itself. And the Tokugawa dynasty was about to fight its last, desperate battle for the soul of Japan. The road to Kyoto was short, but the journey was a passage between centuries. The shogun's generals moved with the slow, crushing confidence of an empire that had never known true defeat. Their armies, 20,000 strong, were a moving landscape of banners and iron, steeped in the 800-year tradition of the samurai. They expected a skirmish, a show of force that would scatter the upstart rebels and reassert the old order. They were marching on a ritual of predictable power. But the ground they sought to reclaim was already cursed by the new age. At the twin villages of Toba and Fushimi, the collision finally came. The shogun's vanguard, still relying on the drawn sword and the mass charge, slammed into an enemy that was prepared for a profoundly different kind of war. Satsuma and Choshu had spent years and fortunes acquiring the newest technology of the West. Repeatable breech-loading rifles, artillery, and disciplined, drilled infantry stood ready. The sound of the first volleys was the sound of history breaking. It was not the noble, rhythmic clash of steel. It was a rapid, impersonal hail of lead that cut down the charging samurai before they could even draw blood. The old ways were instantly, brutally obsolete. The shogunate armies began to crumble, not from a lack of courage, but from an impossible physics of warfare. The Iron Peace had deliberately shielded Japan from this evolution for 2 centuries. Now, that shield was gone, and the dynasty paid the price in torrents of blood and broken formation. Then came the sight that shattered the soul of the shogun's forces more completely than any bullet. High above the rebel lines, a new banner was raised, the gold and red of the imperial court. It was the Nishiki no Mihata, the imperial brocade banner. It was not just a flag, it was a devastating political and spiritual weapon. The rebels had successfully cloaked their rebellion in the sacred authority of the emperor. Now, the shogun's loyalists were no longer fighting rebels and traitors. They were fighting the legitimate army of the Son of Heaven. The deep bedrock loyalty that bound the Tokugawa system together, the unquestioning devotion to the throne, even when ruled in the emperor's name, cracked wide open. To fight on was no longer to defend the shogun's honor. It was an act of treason against the emperor himself. The battle was lost not just on the field, but in the minds of the men. 4 days of confused, bloody fighting was all it took. The shogunate armies, routed, demoralized, and betrayed by the very concept of their own loyalty, streamed back in disorder. The commander of the entire shogunate force, the shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, watched the catastrophe unfold from Osaka Castle. He saw the truth clearly. His army was broken, and the moral authority of his house had evaporated beneath the imperial banner. He made the only decision he felt he could, though it was an act of ultimate disgrace. He abandoned his men. Slipping away under the cover of night, he fled toward Edo, the shogunal capital. He took a fast warship and left the wreckage of his shattered army to fend for itself. It was the deepest humiliation, an act of unforgivable desertion that signaled not just a military defeat, but the end of 260 years of Tokugawa confidence. The road to peace, the road that the Tokugawa had policed for so long, was now open for the enemy to march. The imperial army, high on victory and riding the wave of public support, did not hesitate. They pressed the chase, moving eastward. The goal was no longer the restoration of imperial rule in Kyoto, which they had already secured. The goal was the ultimate prize, the destruction of the Tokugawa dynasty in its own heartland. The war, which had started as a clash outside the imperial city, was now headed toward the greatest, most densely populated urban center on Earth. The great castle of Edo, symbol of the Tokugawa rule, stood directly in the path of the advancing, modern army. The final, unimaginable question hung over all of Japan. Would the centuries-old capital, the jewel of the eastern provinces, burn to ashes in the final, desperate act of the civil war? The shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, arrived in his own capital not as its master but as its ultimate refugee. He was a ghost in his own castle, abandoning his post, his name, and his entire dynasty in a single, unforgivable retreat. He had fled the reality of the war, but the war now chased him right to the gates of his home. The city of Edo waited. It was a population of nearly 2 million souls, the largest metropolis on the planet, and they found themselves suddenly trapped. For 2.5 centuries, they had lived under the iron confidence of the Tokugawa, the promise that peace was perpetual. Now that promise had dissolved. The great castle, built as a fortress against the world, was now a trap for its own inhabitants. With the shogun paralyzed by disgrace and his army leaderless, the burden of saving the city, and the lives of every person within it, fell upon the most unlikely of men, Katsu Kaishu. Katsu was the shogun's minister of the navy, a visionary who had studied abroad and knew that Japan's future lay not in isolation, but in embracing the modern world. He was a military man, but he understood a critical, painful truth. The war was already lost. His only remaining duty was to ensure that the ultimate defeat did not become the ultimate human catastrophe. He looked out over the crowded districts, the wooden homes packed tight like kindling, and understood the calculus of modern war. A single spark, a single vengeful act, and the jewel of the eastern provinces would be incinerated. He made the impossible decision to sue for surrender. He had no authority, no mandate, and no hope of winning. He was offering the key to the empire's greatest city to a victorious enemy who sought nothing less than the absolute extinction of the Tokugawa house. It was the most desperate gamble in the history of the shogunate. Katsu Kaishu's counterpart was the man leading the entire imperial advance, the great general Seigo Takamori. Seigo was an enigma, a man of humble origin who possessed the charisma and discipline of a god of war. He was the sword of the revolution, driven by a fierce, peasant loyalty to the emperor and an absolute hatred for the corruption and weakness of the shogunate. His orders were simple and absolute: crush the Tokugawa. If that meant the destruction of Edo, then so be it. But history had already tied these two men together. Before the war, Katsu and Seigo had met in secret, intellectual titans debating the future of Japan over cups of sake. They had established a bond, a shared respect that transcended their political allegiances. They had stood together as patriots. Now, they stood on opposite sides of a bloody line. The entire fate of the city rested on whether Katsu the statesman could appeal to Seigo the intellectual, and not Seigo the general. The meeting was arranged on the outskirts of the city. A small pavilion, a single table, 2 men of immense opposing authority. The imperial army, the conquerors, waited just behind their general, rifles loaded, ready to march. The silence was heavier than any cannonade. Katsu arrived without ceremony. His offer was a desperate plea. The Tokugawa will surrender unconditionally, the castle will be vacated, the army disbanded. But in return, the shogun must be spared the executioner's blade, and the people of Edo must be spared the torch. Seigo had only to nod, and the war would be over. The final victory of the imperial restoration complete. but his silence was a terrifying thing. To refuse Katsu was to order the slaughter of innocents in a firestorm of his own making. To accept was to show mercy to the man who had ordered the war against the emperor, to allow the symbol of the enemy to live. It was a choice between vengeance and history, between his duty as a general and his conscience as a man. Seigo had reached the pinnacle of his power, holding the entire future of the Japanese nation in his hand. The great general looked across the table, not at his enemy, but at a man he had once called a friend, and he knew that whatever decision he made in that isolated pavilion would define his legacy and the soul of the new Japan forever. The silence stretched, not a lack of sound but the roar of history grinding to a halt. Seigo saw the entire city behind Katsu's eyes, the 3 centuries of peace, the millions of lives, the fragile balance that had held this metropolis together. To accept Katsu's terms meant swallowing the rage of 1,000 imperial loyalists who demanded blood for the perceived slights against the emperor. It meant sacrificing the perfect, unblemished victory that military doctrine demanded. It meant showing profound mercy where the enemy had shown none. But Seigo was more than a soldier. He carried the burden of Japan's future, a vision not of conquest but of true national cohesion. Vengeance would be a fire that might never be put out. It would brand the new government with the stain of mass murder on its very first day. The peace that would follow the ashes would be hollow, built on the shifting sands of resentment. Katsu understood this. He wasn't just begging for lives. He was appealing to Seigo's highest aspirations. He was offering an immediate, clean peace that would legitimize the new rule through an act of magnanimity, setting the foundation for the kind of nation Seigo wanted to build. A long minute passed. The tension in the air was so thick the pavilion roof seemed to sag under it. The general's men, waiting hundreds of yards away, could not hear the words, but they could feel the gravity of the silent exchange. Finally, Seigo let out a single, slow breath, a subtle shifting of weight that settled the fate of an entire city. The decision was not a compromise. It was a profound act of statesmanship, transcending the petty grievances of the war itself. He looked Katsu directly in the eyes. No accusation, no triumph, only the acknowledgement of a shared, terrible responsibility. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The surrender was accepted. Edo would not burn. The shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, would live. The order went out immediately, halt the advance. The imperial forces, poised for the final, bloody triumph, stood down. Katsu returned to Edo Castle, not as a defeated general, but as the architect of its salvation. Within 48 hours, the symbol of Tokugawa authority, the massive stone walls and soaring roofs of Edo Castle, was quietly vacated. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the 15th and final shogun, yielded his authority, not with a defiant battle cry, but with a silent, dignified retreat into obscurity. The great dynasty that had ruled Japan for over 2.5 centuries simply stepped aside. On the 6th day of the 4th month, the imperial banners were raised over the city. They were not stained with the blood of conquest, but clean, signifying a new beginning purchased with mercy. It was a victory for peace, a triumph of diplomacy over war, and it saved the largest city on earth from destruction. But the Tokugawa Shogunate was vast. The war had been won in the capital, but the peace had not yet been secured across the entire nation. Though the head of the serpent had yielded, the body still writhed in defiance. North, in the rugged, snow-caked domains of the Tohoku region, the most fiercely loyal samurai houses refused to recognize the surrender. They saw it not as statesmanship, but as a betrayal to their class, a stain on the warrior code. They had stockpiled modern rifles and cannon. They had raised the banner of the shogun, now defended by a desperate, massive alliance of northern lords known as the Northern Coalition. This was no simple mop-up operation. This was the final, desperate struggle of a warrior class that would rather perish than bow to the new imperial authority. And now, the true battle for the soul of the new Japan, the one that would decide who truly held the mandate of heaven, was about to begin on a landscape utterly alien to the statesmen of Edo. The armies of the north were gathering their strength. They had one final, impossible hope, and their eyes were fixed on one ultimate prize, the imperial court itself, guarded by an ancient, impenetrable fortress known only as Aizu. Aizu was not just a castle, it was a doctrine. It was a citadel of pure, unyielding fealty, built into the heart of the northern mountains, a fortress that had stood guard over the shogun's honor for 2.5 centuries. Its walls were stone and earth, but its foundation was the samurai code, forged into the very character of its people. The lord who held this mantle of honor was Matsudaira Katamari. He had served the Tokugawa with a devotion that bordered on religious zealotry. For him, the surrender of Edo was a profanity, a betrayal of everything his ancestors had fought and died for. The peace was a lie. The only truth left was the sword. Katamari turned his domain into the final, desperate sanctuary of the old order. Every farmer, every merchant, every boy old enough to lift a blade was now a soldier in the final army of the samurai. This loyalty was a virtue, but in the context of the new Japan, it was a cancer. The imperial forces, now reorganizing and consolidating their power in the captured capital, understood this perfectly. The war was supposed to be over. The emperor's mandate had been declared. But the north, centered on the stone defiance of Aizu, mocked that claim. It was an open wound that had to be cauterized. The true architects of the Meiji Restoration knew that history is written by the victors, and this final chapter would be the cruelest. If the imperial reign was to last, if the Iron Peace was to hold, every trace of the old Tokugawa world had to be erased. Leading the main imperial charge was a man named Itagaki Taisuke, a general who embodied the ruthless pragmatism of the new era. He commanded regiments armed with modern Western rifles, field artillery, and a cold, strategic mind that saw the samurai as mere relics, doomed anachronisms standing in the way of progress. Itagaki marched north with a single, clear objective: the complete destruction of Aizu and the permanent submission of the Northern Coalition. There would be no more mercy, no more diplomacy. The time for compromise had ended when Katamari raised the shogun's banner over his impenetrable walls. The Northern Coalition, a gathering of some 30 fierce domains, began their own counter-movement. Their hope was audacious, almost impossible. They would march south, break the imperial lines, and recapture the shogun's momentum. If they could hold Aizu, the moral heart of the resistance, they might yet force the new government to recognize their independent right to exist. They were an army of desperate poets and dying traditions, wielding rifles they barely understood and swords they knew intimately. Their cause was not for victory, but for a magnificent, glorious defeat, a moment that would secure their place in history, even if it cost them their lives. But the imperial army was too fast, too organized, and too powerful. The North's advance faltered and collapsed under relentless modern fire. The coalition was not broken, but they were forced backward, reeling, abandoning their dreams of a southern march. The entire desperate alliance now retreated into the single point of defense they had left. The siege lines began to close around Aizu. The world had narrowed for the northern samurai. The open fields of battle were gone. Now, their entire future was focused into a single, cold valley, watched over by a fortress whose fate was already sealed by the cannon pointed at its walls. The population of the domain knew this was the end. The final defense was not just soldiers, but sons, fathers, and even children. In the midst of this overwhelming dread, one group was formed that would forever define the tragedy of Aizu: the Byakkotai, the White Tiger Force. They were a company composed entirely of boys, barely 16 and 17 years old, too young to fully understand the political currents, but old enough to grasp the pure, absolute meaning of loyalty. Their final duty was to stand upon the high ground, a hill overlooking the besieged castle, and watch. Their orders were simple: protect the citadel from any surprise attack. And from that lonely, exposed ridge, the boys of the White Tiger Force waited, their eyes fixed on the smoke beginning to rise from the valley, praying for a victory they knew would never come, utterly prepared to witness the death of the samurai age. The final chapter of the ancient warrior class was about to begin. The siege was not a duel of honor, it was an execution. It began with a sound that swallowed all others, the roar of the modern gun. The imperial coalition brought the entire, cold weight of the West to bear, artillery that made the old defenses irrelevant. The castle of Aizu was no longer facing arrows or siege towers, it faced the future. Rifled cannon shells struck the ancient stone walls not with a friendly, manageable thud, but with an explosive tear, ripping away centuries of careful construction, sending plumes of dust and history into the air. This was the fire that had consumed the shogun in the south, and now it was here, relentless and unforgiving. For a month the defenders endured the shelling. No retreat was possible. Every soldier inside Tsuruga Castle knew their fight was merely for time. Foe are an illusion of resistance. They rationed rice and hoarded gunpowder, watching the cedar and plaster of the inner citadel splinter, fall, and then catch the terrible, modern flame. The walls themselves seemed to cry out, shaking under the constant percussion. Beneath the castle, miles of tunnels had been dug, sanctuaries for women, children, and the wounded, chambers carved from the earth, trying to escape a storm that felt like the wrath of heaven itself. But even underground, the fear was a constant, suffocating companion. The dust filtered down, and the terrible sound of the new world hammering on the old never stopped. High above the misery, on the rocky shoulder of Mount Iyamari, the boys of the White Tiger Force felt the artillery fire not as sound, but as a dull, repetitive punch in the chest. They were a sentinel group, 60 young men frozen in a vigil of useless loyalty. Their orders to watch had quietly shifted into orders to simply witness. The true enemy was not the soldiers below, but the smoke. It began rising in thick, black, oily columns, first from the outlying samurai mansions, where the imperial army was clearing the path. Then it spread to the merchant quarters, turning the city of Wakamatsu into a sacrificial pyre. Soon, all the individual fires merged, becoming a single, vast, suffocating cloud that blotted out the sun and all the remaining hope beneath it. Aizu was not merely being attacked, it was being consumed. On the ridge, the Byakkotai watched the inferno. Their perfect, strategic vantage point had become a perfect, heartbreaking seat for a tragedy. Through the gaps in the rolling, coal-black fog, they saw what they believed was the absolute end. The massive, dark cloud had shifted, obscuring everything but the core of the castle complex. And then, through the smoke, they saw the towers of Tsuruga Castle themselves, or what looked like the main citadel, erupt in a final, hungry bloom of flame. The fire was so intense, the despair so absolute, that the reality of the situation dissolved into a single, overwhelming certainty. The castle had fallen. The fight was over. The ancient line had been broken. They had all taken an oath, an absolute vow, etched into the very core of their being. They would never surrender, and they would never live past the final, certain fall of their lord. To see the castle burn, to believe the final resistance had been crushed, was to believe their entire reason for existence was gone. Their only path now was the pure, final duty of a samurai. The boys looked at the smoking valley, then at each other. No words were needed. They turned from the inferno, drawing their swords in unison, moving towards the only honorable path left to them, utterly prepared for the one final act that would seal their fate forever. They lifted the blades to their own throats, prepared to die for a master who was not yet lost, prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice based on a terrible, fatal mistake. A chilling, perfect trap. They stood on the lip of a cold mountain, utterly alone, performing an ultimate act of loyalty to a historical truth that was no longer true. They had sworn to die upon the Lord's defeat, and in the rolling smoke of the valley, they saw that defeat made manifest. It was the purest form of final, absolute duty. The silence that fell was not the silence of peace, but the quiet of iron conviction, a stillness heavier than the coal-black smoke they breathed. They did not hesitate. The iron taste of duty was all they knew. They were 7 ghosts preparing to cross the river. But the mistake was not just theirs. It was the mistake of an entire age. This immediate, heartbreaking tragedy was merely the final, agonizing symptom of a profound national illness. This castle fire, this shattering of ancient hope, was the end result of a dynasty that had achieved its goal too completely. It was the terrible consequence of 3 centuries of uninterrupted, total peace. The entire nation's reason for existence, for 260 years, had been the preservation of order. The Tokugawa Shogunate had taken a land fractured by ceaseless civil war, a landscape of endless battlefields, and hammered it into a single, unified, frozen whole. The promise of the shogun was simple and absolute: stability at any cost. No more armies marching, no more lords vying for dominance. This was the Pax Tokugawa, the Iron Peace. And it worked. 1,000 years of conflict simply stopped. The sword became a symbol, a decoration rather than a tool of survival. The old fire of the warrior class was banked and smothered. For generations, the samurai did not know war. They became bureaucrats, scholars, philosophers. They became guardians of a system that no longer required guardians. They settled into the deep, suffocating security of a nation that had simply stopped moving. It was a chilling, perfect trap. The very peace the Tokugawa had fought so hard to win was the thing that would ultimately undo them. Absolute stasis is the ultimate illusion. Beneath the flawless, mirrored surface of the shogun's rule, the iron began to rust. The merchant class, officially lowest in rank, grew fat on the stillness, holding the true economic power in their hands while the samurai struggled with fixed stipends. The rigid, perfect system that guaranteed stability also guaranteed stagnation. The farmers starved. The economy strained. And across the vast, lonely seas, the world was changing faster than anyone in Edo could imagine. The shogunate had kept Japan a secret, a locked box to the world, a beautiful, dangerous, tightly wound secret. They called it Sakoku, the chained country. But secrets do not last forever. In the year 1853, the first shadow fell across the sun. Not the shadow of another great lord marching on the capital, but the smoke of a distant machine. Out of the vast, unknowable Pacific Ocean came the ships. Black, monstrous, belching smoke, unlike anything the Japanese people had ever seen. The ships bore an impossible demand, an ultimatum that would fracture the entire political system down to its bedrock. A demand delivered by iron hulls and the cold, unblinking mouths of cannons. The arrival of the black ships was the shockwave that traveled backward through time. It was the sound of the entire iron peace cracking. It was the true genesis of the inferno that now lit the valley below. And the young men, the boys on the mountain peak, their blades drawn and held to their own throats, were the final, tragic echo of that fatal sound. They stood prepared to die for a master who was not yet lost, prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice based on a terrible, fatal mistake, because the world they had sworn to defend was already gone. They only needed the final moment to descend into their own eternal silence. But as the steel touched the skin of the first young soldier, the silence was shattered. A sound not of battle but of utter desperation cut through the night. The thundering gallop of a single horse, ridden in a mad, reckless sprint up the mountain trail, its rider shouting a warning that was impossible to believe. "Stop," he was shouting, "stop." The castle had not fallen. The Lord was still alive. The world had frozen on the edge of the blade. The shout had done its work, ripping the veil of silence from the ritual. A collective gasp, not of pain, but of impossible disbelief, hung over the cold summit. It was the sound of a man who suddenly realizes the fatal bullet passed an inch from his head. The rider, a young scout whose lungs had been emptied of all air in the climb, collapsed off his mount, spitting dust and frantic words into the dark. The castle had not fallen. The battle was still raging. It was a victory, or at least a stalemate, not the crushing defeat they had assumed. The samurai, their sleeves still wet with the sweat of their own fatal error, slowly lowered their steel. The shame of being spared a necessary death was a heavier weight than the fear of dying. They had been ready to end the world for a fiction, and now they were forced back into a reality they no longer understood. This single, brutal moment of confusion on a cold mountain peak was the entire war in miniature. The conflict tearing Japan apart was not merely a territorial dispute. It was not a simple dynastic struggle. It was a war waged entirely in the abstract, a struggle for identity. For 300 years, the Iron Peace had demanded perfect, total loyalty to a static, unchanging order. That stability, enforced by the Tokugawa Shogunate, was all that these young men had ever known. Now, that order was fracturing, and the entire warrior class was left floating, fighting for ghosts. They were men prepared to sacrifice everything for a loyalty they could no longer place. Was it to the shogun, the actual, sitting ruler in Edo, or to the distant, mystical emperor in Kyoto, whose name was now being weaponized by firebrands and revolutionaries? The domains of the far west, notably Choshu and Satsuma, had taken the arrival of the black ships and twisted the foreign threat into a divine mandate for domestic revolution. They did not attack the shogunate with armies alone. They attacked with history, with poetry, and with the sacred, unassailable name of the emperor. For centuries, the emperor had been a ceremonial deity, a silenced relic in the imperial palace, concerned only with seasonal rites and classical verse. The revolutionaries dusted off that relic and used his divine status as a battering ram against the Tokugawa edifice. The goal was not reform. It was the complete bloody annihilation of the shogun's power. This was not a rebellion. It was an imperial restoration, a sudden, brutal reversal of 300 years of history. It was the ultimate betrayal of the Iron Peace. The very domains the shogunate had successfully silenced had risen up, using the shogun's own historical mandate, the rule on behalf of the emperor, as the tool for his final destruction. What began as distant, localized skirmishes around treaty ports was now a national contagion. The war machine of the shogunate was vast, but it was slow, burdened by the very weight of its ancient bureaucracy and its own paralyzing sense of obligation. The revolutionaries were lean, fast, and fueled by a fanaticism that felt almost religious, driven by the seductive promise of remaking the nation in the fires of a holy war. They burned through the countryside, forcing the great lords to choose sides, plunging the cities into darkness and chaos. The samurai on the mountain peak, now spared from their own self-inflicted end, were faced with a far greater, more agonizing question. Their lord was alive, the castle held, but the fight was no longer local. They could descend the mountain and return to the temporary safety of the walls, or they could throw themselves into the abyss of a civil war where the terms of loyalty changed with every sunrise. They looked down from the peak, not at a distant, familiar fortress, but at the sprawling, fiery horizon, where the entire world they knew was waiting to burn, waiting for the final, devastating contest. And they knew, with the cold certainty of the newly spared, that their moment of crisis was over, but the great, final crisis of the nation was just beginning. The path ahead was straight to the capital, where the last, desperate act of the shogunate was about to play out, and the entire history of Japan would be placed upon the edge of a single, monumental decision. The path ahead was straight to the capital, where the last, desperate act of the shogunate was about to play out, and the entire history of Japan would be placed upon the edge of a single, monumental decision. The final destination was Edo, not a fortress in the mountains, but a sprawling, decadent city of over 1 million souls, the true beating heart of the empire, a metropolis that had known 260 years of absolute, enforced silence. Edo was the living proof of the shogunate's success, its vast castle walls holding the collected power and history of the Tokugawa dynasty. Now that immense silence was shattering, broken not by the roar of cannons, but by the relentless, terrifying whisper of approaching armies. The man at the center of this hurricane was Tokugawa Ieyasu. He was the 15th and final shogun, the last vessel for a power structure conceived in blood and maintained by an iron will. But Ieyasu was not the granite warrior of his ancestors. He was an intellectual, a modernizer, an unlikely final heir, a man of the mind cursed to inherit a crisis that demanded only the sword. He had been forced into the role, and now he was forced to make a choice no man should have to face. The revolutionaries did not call themselves rebels. They marched beneath the sacred red and white brocade of the emperor, the Nishiki no Mahata, the imperial banner. This was not merely a civil war, it was a divine sanction. They were not fighting the government, they were restoring the gods. Any samurai who raised a weapon against that banner was committing treason, not against the shogun, but against the very soul of the nation. This theological leverage was sharper than any blade they carried. As the tide flowed north, the shogun's generals prepared the defense. They were hardened men, loyalists who still believed in the sanctity of their ancient mandate. They looked at the 3 million pounds of gold stored in the castle vaults, at the modern cannon they had procured from the French, at the tens of thousands of dedicated, battle-ready troops, and they saw a fight they could still win. If the shogunate could not be saved by diplomacy, it would be saved by a mountain of corpses. But Ieyasu, standing in the massive quiet of Edo Castle, saw something else entirely. He looked out over the roofs of the city, the homes of 1 million common people, merchants, craftsmen, priests, who had lived their entire lives under the assurance of peace. He knew that a battle for the capital would not merely be a battle, it would be a slaughter on a scale Japan had never witnessed. If the gates were sealed and the Tokugawa loyalists were ordered to fight to the last man, Edo would burn to the ground, transforming a political disagreement into a national apocalypse. He would save his honor, but he would destroy the peace his family had spent centuries forging. The moment for subtle maneuvering was gone. The enemy armies arrived in the distance, their presence an undeniable shadow across the land. The revolutionaries' demands were simple: surrender the castle, surrender your authority, and surrender the entirety of the Tokugawa legacy, or face the total, devastating annihilation of the capital. The most powerful man in Japan was suddenly the most paralyzed. His generals begged him for the order to fight, their fingers twitching on their sword hilts. They saw betrayal in delay. They saw weakness in hesitation. They were samurai, and their honor demanded a glorious, final, bloody defense. But the shogun knew that the greatest glory was not always to be found in fighting. Sometimes, the greatest, most agonizing act of duty was surrender. The weight of 2 centuries of peace settled on his shoulders, crushing the samurai out of him and leaving only a man alone in a fortress, holding the match to the entire nation. He walked the long, dark corridors of the great castle, listening to the silence of his ancestors. The entire history of Japan was holding its breath, waiting for the order to fire the cannons. The choice was no longer between victory and defeat. It was between the immediate, violent end of a dynasty and the preservation of a national future. The final Tokugawa stood at the ramparts, watching the sun rise upon the vast, silent, waiting city of Edo. The day had come, and the final shogun was about to decide whether his reign would end with a final, magnificent fire, or with a whisper of absolute capitulation. He closed his eyes, and in that moment, the vision of the magnificent fire vanished. The imagined roar of the cannons was replaced by the silent, haunting memory of 260 years of unbroken calm. He was not a samurai making a personal choice. He was the guardian of an entire nation's stability. The decision was no longer about his honor. It was about 700,000 people sleeping below the ramparts, oblivious to the knife edge upon which their city rested. To fight would have been magnificent. To fight would have sealed his place in legend as the last, glorious commander of a fading world. But it would also have cost Japan its capital, its infrastructure, and its immediate future. The samurai in him died a necessary, private death. The shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, gave the command for absolute capitulation. He would surrender the castle, the authority, and the legacy. He would walk out alone, a man without a title, so that the city of Edo might simply wake up to another, quiet morning. He sent the emissary with the letter of surrender, an act more agonizing than any sword blow. He had chosen peace for the nation by choosing shame for himself. The iron peace of the Tokugawa Shogunate would end not with a magnificent, terrible blaze, but with a whisper of unimaginable, lonely sacrifice. When the order was delivered to the inner circle, the great halls of the castle erupted not in cheers, but in a deafening, magnificent silence. The veteran generals could not speak the word of surrender. They saw only betrayal. They had been samurai their entire lives, prepared to give their last breath for the dynasty's final stand. They had been robbed of their duty, their honor stripped away by the very man they swore to protect. The delay, they now understood, was not hesitation. It was capitulation. Rage, pure and terrifying, began to replace loyalty. The shogun's closest men saw him no longer as a savior of the capital, but as a traitor to the code of the warrior. They would not follow him into silence. They would not accept this ignoble peace. In the dead of night, they watched the shogun slip away from the castle that had been the seat of his power, disguised and alone, abandoning his destiny. The next morning, the great gates of Edo Castle, the symbolic heart of the Tokugawa legacy, swung inward. They opened not with the crash of battle, but with a quiet, terrible scraping sound. The revolutionary imperial forces marched into the fortress. They took the seat of power without firing a single cannon shot. The 268-year reign of the shoguns ended, as the city sighed and simply went back to sleep. The victory was immediate and total. The government was gone. The dynasty was finished. The capital was secured. But the war for Japan was not over. For the hardline loyalists, the shogun's sacrifice was not a moment of statesmanship, but an unforgivable act of cowardice. They refused to accept that the legacy could simply be folded away like a forgotten piece of parchment. Their oath was not to the man, but to the very concept of Tokugawa authority, to the code of the samurai that demanded blood for honor. The fight had been lost in the capital, but it could still be won in the north. As the imperial banners were raised over Edo Castle, a corps of men, the fiercest, most unyielding samurai, refused to lay down their swords. They prepared to evacuate. They began moving north into the forbidding, isolated domains, drawing with them all the fury and loyalty that had been denied its final fight. They would take the war, the true war, far from the shogun's shame, into a region of snow and shadow, where the iron will of the samurai could finally make its magnificent, desperate stand. The battle for Edo was a victory for peace, but the battle for the future of Japan was about to begin, led by the bitter, furious men who would not accept their dynasty had ended. They were going to build a new, desperate line of defense, a fortress not of stone, but of ice and absolute, blinding loyalty. They moved not as defeated soldiers, but as mourners carrying a stolen and sacred legacy. The silence of Edo's peace was a scream in their hearts. They slipped away in spectral columns, their footsteps muffled by the same dust that had gathered over 2 centuries of Tokugawa rule. These were the fierce remnants, the shogun's personal guard, the dedicated veterans of the Shinsengumi, and those officials whose oath to the dynasty was carved into their very soul. They carried the shogunate's last reserves of gold, its finest artillery, and its most potent, irreconcilable rage. Their destination was the frigid world of Tohoku, the rugged north, a place where honor was understood to be something more than a tool of political compromise. For the loyalists, the imperial army advancing from the west were not liberators or reformers, but an invading horde. They threatened not just a government, but a way of life that had been stable and absolute for generations. The north had always been distant from the heart of power, isolated by mountains and snow, and proudly conservative. The samurai of the northern domains, the daimyō whose families had ruled their land since the dawn of the shogunate, saw the new emperor's men as a modern, dangerous threat to their ancient identity. The loyalist exodus was quickly met by a furious alliance. 18 northern domains, united by a fear of invasion and a shared commitment to the old code, unified in emergency. They called their new alliance the Aetsu Reppen Domai, the Northern Coalition. It was a desperate marriage of convenience, shared tradition, and sheer terror. They pooled their rice stores and their armies. This was a war of defense, but far more deeply, it was a war for their very identity. If the shogun had surrendered his power, they would not surrender their pride. The spiritual heart of this entire movement became the mountainous domain of Aizu. The lord of Aizu, Matsudera Katamari, had served as the shogun's guardian of Kyoto, a post of the highest trust and devotion. His loyalty was not a political calculation, but a personal, consuming fire. Aizu became the defiant capital of the Ghost Dynasty. Its vast fortress, Aizu Wakamatsu, stood against the deep winter snows and the approaching spring mud, a physical symbol of everything the South had surrendered. Within its walls, men prepared for a fight that they knew would not simply be military, but existential. The women and children were put to work preparing the defensive earthworks. This was not a castle that would simply yield to a gentle sigh. But the imperial court in Kyoto saw this northern coalition not as a legitimate political force, but as an act of criminal conspiracy and treason. They could not allow a rebellion to take root. The new government's legitimacy depended on swift, total control. They dispatched the main body of their modern army, fresh from the quiet victory in Edo. The order was simple: destroy the northern resistance quickly, violently, and completely. The year was 1868. The summer brought no warmth to the north, only the crushing weight of impending war. The imperial army, modern, confident, and marching under the banner of a reborn emperor, was finally arriving at the borders of the newly drawn line of loyalty. The loyalists waited for them, armed with ancient oaths, borrowed European cannons, and a commitment to a world that was already slipping into shadow. Two different Japans, one marching toward the future and one clinging to the magnificent, frozen past, were about to collide. The polite surrender in the capital was over. The Boshin War was about to begin its true, bloody chapter, an immense battle for the soul of the nation, to be fought far from the light, in the unforgiving, shadowed fields of the north. The North Tohoku was a land of unforgiving mountains and deep snow, a world that distrusted central power. It was a place where the old ways died hard, where loyalty was measured not in political alliances but in generations of shared sacrifice. The Northern Coalition, officially the Aetsu Retsu Domai, stretched for hundreds of miles, a loose chain of 24 domains. They were united, but only barely. They drew their line of defense across the narrow mountain passes, a desperate attempt to seal off their world from the march of the future. They had one fragile advantage: the brutal, complicated terrain. They had one profound disadvantage: everything else. Their forces were a patchwork of traditional samurai, peasant levies, and hastily trained riflemen. Their rifles were often obsolete matchlocks. Their commanders had been trained for peacetime parades, not total war. They believed that the courage of the spirit could overcome the cold mathematics of firepower. The Imperial High Command understood the geography, and they knew the weakness of the spirit. They did not intend to negotiate with history, nor with mountain passes. They needed to break the line quickly, to shatter the alliance and scatter the fragments. They sent their most lethal regiments, the ones armed with the latest Western breech-loading rifles, the ones led by generals who understood European tactics of rapid movement and overwhelming concentration of force. The target was the linchpin of the northern defense. The target was Shirakawa Castle. Shirakawa was the hinge. If it fell, the entire northern defense would immediately fold inward, leaving the vast interior of the north exposed. The main road would be open all the way to the ultimate prize, Aizu Wakamatsu, the deeply fortified center of the resistance. For the samurai defenders of the castle, this was not just a battle for ground. It was a desperate final stand for the very meaning of their resistance, a defense of the Tokugawa legitimacy that they held sacred. For the imperial soldiers, it was a practical exercise in modern conquest. The ideological stakes were high, but the military calculus was cold and simple. The assault began in late summer, a terrifying, deafening symphony of steel and smoke. It was here that the true lesson of the new age was delivered. The brave, inherited valor of the samurai forces, fighting with a zeal that belonged to a different century, could not stand against the sustained, focused firepower of the imperial army. Their desperate charges, meant to break the enemy line with cold steel, broke instead against a storm of coordinated rifle volleys. Their cannons, often old, often misfiring, were silenced by accurate, long-range European artillery. It was a systematic, merciless destruction disguised as a battle. It took only a few weeks of brutal, close-quarters fighting. Shirakawa Castle fell. The gate of the north was not merely opened, it was violently smashed from its hinges. The fall sent a profound, shattering tremor of panic through the entire coalition. Loyalty, which had been stretched thin by old interdomain rivalries, now snapped under the crushing weight of fear and the sight of defeat. Domain after domain began to desert the failing alliance, desperate to negotiate a peace before the imperial juggernaut reached their walls. The Grand Alliance of the North dissolved, almost overnight, into a collection of terrified, isolated territories. The war was no longer one of coalition against coalition. It was now a hunt. But the imperial army did not stop to accept their hurried surrenders. They did not pause to count the cost. The message from the new government was cold and absolute. The war was not over until the symbol of the resistance, the very heart of the old guard, was extinguished. All roads now led to one place, across the mountains, deep into the most loyal territory in all of Japan. The imperial forces gathered themselves, reorganized, and prepared for the final, bloody siege. They were marching on Aizu. All roads now led to Aizu, but for the men inside its walls, those roads had become one-way avenues to the grave. Aizu Wakamatsu was not merely a military fortress. It was the sacred, beating heart of Tokugawa loyalty. For 2 centuries, this domain had been the most steadfast, the most unyielding pillar of the shogunate. Its soldiers believed the very dirt beneath their feet was consecrated by their allegiance. Now their city was a final island in a rising tide. The Lord of Aizu, Matsudera Katamari, carried the full, terrible weight of that loyalty. It was his misfortune to have been the shogunate's representative in Kyoto, the man who had ordered the purge of imperial loyalists. In the eyes of the new government, he was not a mere opponent. He was the primary criminal, the face of the doomed resistance. Katamari knew there would be no negotiation, no surrender accepted. The imperial army would not stop until his family name was erased and his castle was a ruin of ash and stone. Honor demanded only one path, a defense to the death. The castle walls were strengthened, old cannons were wheeled into place, and the stores were checked for the last time. The samurai prepared for the longest night of their lives. But the price of their steadfast loyalty was now measured not in political power, but in human scarcity. The ranks of the fighting men were desperately thin. The flower of Aizu's adult warriors had already been cut down defending Shirakawa and the other frontier passes. In this extremity, the samurai class turned to its children. It was a desperation unique to Aizu, a final, horrifying calculus of war. Boys barely 16 years of age, too young to even wear the topknot of a full samurai, were taken from their studies and given a sword. They were formed into the Byakkotai, the White Tiger Brigade. They were meant to be reserves. A secondary defense, messengers carrying final orders through smoke and chaos. In reality, they were a sacrifice being prepared, a testament to a dynasty that had devoured its own future. 24 young faces, pale with fear and excitement, stood ready to die for a cause they did not fully understand, only that it was their father's cause. The stage was set for the final act of destruction. On the other side of the mountains, the imperial forces were a different kind of army altogether. They were a modern force, led by generals who had studied European tactics. They were methodical, professional, and terrifyingly cold. Their commander, General Itagaki Taisuke, did not intend to waste men in costly frontal assaults on the main castle walls. That was the old way of war. He would employ the new. His plan was simple and vicious: bypass the walls entirely. The imperial forces, moving with brutal efficiency, swept through the mountain passes and encircled the castle town completely. They cut every road, blocked every escape route, and isolated Aizu from the world. Then the long wait was over. On the 23rd day of August, the silence was shattered. There was no charge, no heroic trumpet call, only the distant, hollow cough of heavy European artillery. The imperial army was not shelling the fortified castle. They were targeting the civilian populace. Shells rained down indiscriminately upon the wooden houses, the rice stores, and the narrow streets of the city below. The tactic was meant to break the spirit of the people, to choke the town with panic and fire, and to force the desperate defenders to abandon the high walls to save their families. It worked. Aizu Wakamatsu exploded into a nightmare of smoke and flame. The centuries of iron peace had vanished in an hour. As the desperate samurai rushed to defend their burning homes, the gates of the citadel were left momentarily exposed. And the imperial forces, swift and utterly merciless, began their terrifying advance into the burning city itself. The final, bloody siege had begun. The air itself was a weapon. It was thick with the chemical stench of gunpowder and the sickening sweet smell of burning wood and flesh. This was not the orderly, honorable clash of ancient armies. It was a massacre conducted in a furnace. The samurai, trained for centuries in the art of the blade, suddenly found themselves facing a relentless, invisible enemy. The new imperial forces wielded rapid-fire rifles, shattering the illusion of Aizu's impenetrable defense. Every shadow held a bullet. The narrow streets, designed to confuse and delay invaders, now became lethal funnels for the concentrated attacking fire. 1,000 small, brutal battles erupted simultaneously, house by house, corner by corner. For the Aizu men, the fighting became a slow, ritualistic dance of grief. They were not defending a mere territory. They were defending 300 years of the Tokugawa peace, the very concept of Bushido as they understood it. This absolute loyalty, instilled since birth, had become a terrible cage. The world they knew was already ash, yet they fought on. Among the defenders were the boys of the White Tiger Corps, the Byakkotai. Teenagers, barely men, armed with whatever they could carry, witnessing the total destruction of their entire world. They were meant to be the future, but they found themselves forced to become the final, bloody sacrifice. They saw their homes fall, their families scattered, and the only path left was the one that ended with the blade in hand. The most horrifying realization was not the loss of the battle, but the loss of the purpose. Their sacrifice would not save Aizu. It would only sanctify the manner of its passing. Slowly, desperately, the remaining forces were pushed back toward the towering citadel. The attackers, ruthless and methodical, did not celebrate their gains. They simply advanced, stepping over the fallen and securing the ruins, leaving a trail of black smoke and silence behind them. General Itagaki's strategy had worked flawlessly. The enemy had been drawn from the high walls and exhausted in the urban hellscape. The fight had never been fair. It was not a contest of courage, but of technology. The centuries-old earthworks and fortifications of Aizu were meaningless against the cold, modern iron of the West. When the last of the loyalist defenders crossed the moat and sealed the great castle gates behind them, they were not retreating to safety. They were retreating to a tomb. Inside those stone walls, thousands of people, samurai, farmers, women, and children, now waited. They were the last bastion of a dying age, gathered in the core of the ancient city. The outside world had collapsed entirely. A deep silence fell over the castle grounds, heavier than any artillery barrage. The main walls had held, but the people knew the end was a matter of hours, not days. The remaining samurai prepared for their final stand on the battlements, but the women of Aizu knew their duty was different. The code of Bushido applied to them just as surely. Capture meant shame, capture meant defilement. As the gates were locked, the elderly mothers, the sisters, and the young wives of the samurai gathered in the deep inner rooms of the fortress. They looked at the smoke-filled sky, at the towering stone that would soon be their prison, and understood the absolute price of their 3 centuries of loyalty. The greatest battle was not fought with rifles on the wall, but in the deepest, most private chambers of the castle itself. It was time for the women of Aizu to fulfill their duty. The quiet rooms of the inner castle became altars. The great hall, designed for peace and council, was now prepared for a silent, terrible ceremony. There was no frenzy, no panicked shouting. There was only the meticulous, ordered cadence of centuries of duty. The women of Aizu, the wives and daughters of the commanders, were performing the final ritual of an age. They unwound the elaborate pins from their long, dark hair, letting it fall freely, a symbolic rejection of worldly vanity. The obi sashes, once worn to signify status and beauty, were cinched tightly beneath their breasts, preparing the body for a final, single movement. They exchanged last, formal words with one another, quiet vows of honor, forgiveness, and eternal loyalty. They were not individuals making a choice, but agents fulfilling a silent covenant for a generation yet unborn. Then they sat. In the flickering shadowlight of a paper lantern, each woman produced the small, razor-sharp kaiken dagger, traditionally carried for self-defense. For the female samurai, this was their final instrument of war. They turned their gaze toward the shogun's distant capital, a final, unseeing bow to a dynasty that had demanded everything. The sacrifice was total. It was the purest embodiment of the Bushido Code, paid for not with a moment of reckless courage, but with the entire weight of their lives. 1,000 simultaneous, silent acts of courage, all for the preservation of an honor the enemy could never be allowed to steal. The only sound inside the stone walls was the low, distant rumble of artillery, a constant reminder of the collapsing world outside. But the war was not only fought by the veteran men inside, or the sacrificial women deep within the castle's core. The war also consumed the children of Aizu. Outside the main walls, a separate tragedy was unfolding, equally devastating and utterly pointless. The Byakkotai, the White Tiger Force, were not men but boys. They were teenagers, many no older than 16, pressed into service when the professional warriors had all been spent. They were one of the 4 legendary forces of Aizu, distinguished by the animals of Chinese mythology, but their hearts were too young for such a dark, final fight. A small column of these boys, separated from the main force in the chaos, fought a brutal, desperate retreat across the burning city. They struggled through smoke and ruin, ignoring the shouts of the imperial soldiers, focused only on one duty: getting back inside the castle walls to defend their lord. They fought their way out of the perimeter and found the only clear path, a steep, forested ridge overlooking the valley. They climbed with frantic energy, their lungs burning, driven only by the terror of being abandoned, of being shamed by surviving a lost war. Finally, they stumbled out onto the crest of Iemoriyama Hill. Below them, the entire valley of Aizu was visible. It was no longer a city, but a monstrous, consuming funeral pyre. Nearly every house, every temple, every ancient structure was engulfed in flame, a vast sea of rolling, suffocating smoke. The fighting had reached a desperate, climactic pitch, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the force of the cannonade. The boys huddled together, 15 and 16-year-olds, utterly exhausted, looking down upon the destruction of their home, their world, their entire reason for existence. And then they saw it. Rising from the very center of the maelstrom, from the core of the ancient city, a column of fire ascended, taller and blacker than any other smoke in the valley. It rose with terrible finality, clearly originating from the position of Tsuruga Castle. To the weary, shell-shocked eyes of the Byakkotai, the message was absolute. No army could burn like that. Only a deliberate act, a conscious decision by the remaining commanders to set the entire castle alight, to commit to total immolation rather than allow the shogun's fortress to fall intact into enemy hands. They saw their final sanctuary destroyed. They saw their commanders consumed. They saw their reason for fighting disappear in the terrible, rising heat of a final sacrifice. Their sacred duty, their purpose, their honor, it had all been reduced to ashes on a signal fire. There was no longer a home to PR. Odect, there was no longer a lord to defend. There was only the unbearable, ultimate shame of remaining alive when everything they loved had perished. One of the boys, barely a man, spoke the simple, cold truth to his comrades. The castle is lost. The commander of the White Tiger Force drew his sword. His eyes did not leave the towering pillar of fire. He did not hesitate. The blade rose, shining not with the light of the sun, but with the cold, terrible internal glare of absolute resolve. He was 19, the youngest commander in the long history of the Aizu clan. The commander of the White Tiger Force saw only the bloodline of their ancestors, the unbroken code written in the heart of every samurai since the dawn of the shogunate. He spoke 3 words, the final, silent invocation of their oath. His sword cut through the air, piercing the earth at his knees. He placed a small, ceremonial piece of silk on the blood-stained ground. Then he knelt. His life, measured in a handful of hurried seasons, was now to be offered up for a past that no longer existed and a duty that had been extinguished. The sight was not battle. It was a terrible, maiden sacrifice of youth to the altar of honor. One by one, the other boys watched. They were brothers, bound by an invisible string of loyalty tighter than any chain of command. They understood. In that moment of utter annihilation, the pain of living was now infinitely greater than the pain of dying. The shame of surrender was absolute. The shame of survival was eternal. The commander plunged the steel into himself. It was a gasping, silent testament to a loyalty that refused to acknowledge defeat. But there was no designated second, no kaishikunin, left to deliver the final, clean, merciful blow. There was no one left but themselves. They would all be kaishikunin for one another, and ultimately for themselves. They gripped their swords. 15 boys, far too young to have even seen a proper battle, now utterly certain in the finality of their action. The code demanded it. The burning castle commanded it. The loss of their entire world enforced it. The first boy fell into the snow. Then the second. A silent, rapid succession of decisions made in blood and fire. The remaining 12 boys adjusted their swords, their faces locked in expressions of grim, final peace. They saw their leader's body begin to slump and knew the moment was upon them. They looked at the column of black smoke, knowing their names would be written in the annals of Aizu as the final, pure note of the shogun's song. But just as the third member of the White Tiger Force prepared to commit his final, fatal act, just as his arms tensed and his mind closed against the world, a movement caught his eye. Not the enemy, not the flames. It was a man, a lone figure running up the hill, frantic and stumbling through the smoke of the distant bombardment. He was covered in soot and terror, frantically waving his arms. He screamed a name. He screamed a warning that seemed utterly impossible to hear above the noise of the shelling. The boy froze, his katana trembling only inches from his own abdomen. The sacred silence of their ritual was brutally shattered by the intrusion of this desperate, running messenger. The boy's eyes, fixed on the runner, were filled with the final, cold confusion of a dream interrupted. The man reached the crest of the Ieyasu hill. He collapsed onto the frozen, bloody ground where the boys knelt in their ritual, gasping and weeping. The message he carried was simple, unbelievable, and absolutely devastating to the White Tiger Force. It was a betrayal of their entire final sacrifice. "Wait," the runner cried out, dragging himself toward the surviving boys, his voice hoarse from yelling. "Wait, it is not true, the castle is not lost. You must stop, they did not burn it." The remaining members of the Byakkotai looked down at their commander's body, then up at the impossible, chaotic words of the man. They had seen the fire. They had felt the end. They had already paid the price. But the messenger's next words erased the very foundation of their sacrifice and replaced it with a different, deeper kind of ultimate shame. "The enemy is not yet inside the walls," he choked out, staring at the bloody ground where the first boys lay. It was just a rice storehouse that was burning, just a storehouse for provisions. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence heavier and more final than any cannonade, a silence that fell over the Byakkotai as they finally understood the brutal, final, unspeakable truth. They had not died for their lord. They had died for a mistake. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence heavier and more final than any cannonade, a silence that fell over the Byakkotai as they finally understood the brutal, final, unspeakable truth. They had not died for their lord. They had died for a mistake. A small, insignificant fire in a distant storehouse had consumed 18 lives and, in a way, the very soul of the Tokugawa resistance. The irony was a punishment colder than the deep Aizu snow. It was a tragedy so perfectly misaligned that it seemed less like an accident and more like the final, bitter, crushing judgment of history itself. The White Tiger Force was not alone in its fatal error. The entire shogunate, the whole rigid, 265-year order, was fighting a war for an ideal that was already dead. They were clinging to a history that no longer existed against a foe who had already looked far beyond the islands of Japan. The fall of Aizu was the final, desperate convulsion of an era. The Iron Peace, forged in the heat of Sekigahara by Tokugawa Ieyasu, was finally, irrevocably broken. For centuries, the shoguns had controlled the country through a policy of calculated stagnation. Peace was maintained by freezing society in place, by severing all but the thinnest threads of contact with the outside world. This was the brilliant, if brittle, foundation of the Tokugawa dynasty. It guaranteed calm, but it also guaranteed a profound, dangerous isolation. While Europe and America were forging a new world out of steam, steel, and gunpowder, Japan remained a world of samurai swords and rice economy. The cost of this perfect, frozen peace was becoming brutally clear on the bloody slopes of Iemori Hill. But the victors of the Boshin War offered no nostalgic comfort. The forces gathering under the imperial banner were not merely replacing one ruling family with another. They were bringing forth a new, violent doctrine, heralded by the young Emperor Meiji and his fiercely pragmatic advisors. Their cry was not for tradition, but for progress. Their vision was a radical and total restructuring of the nation, a forced march into modernity known as the Meiji Restoration. The sacred seclusion was over. Japan's gates were not merely open, they were violently thrown wide to embrace the very industrial military power they had long sought to exclude. Swords would be traded for rifles, feudal domains for prefectures, and the loyalties of a warrior for the demands of the modern state. The old world was being dismantled, piece by deliberate piece. But to understand the terrible, inevitable tragedy of Aizu, we must look backward, across the 15 years of escalating crisis that made the sacrifice of the Byakkotai unavoidable. The spark that ignited this entire, fatal war did not come from a rebellious domain in the south, nor from the inner turmoil of the shogun's court. It came from the sea. It came from an invisible, global force of ambition and empire that pressed upon Japan's shores with the weight of an oncoming tide. The men of the shogunate were so focused on policing their internal borders that they failed to see the danger gathering on the horizon. And then, on a calm, summer day in 1853, the sea itself seemed to turn hostile. It was in the waters off the coast of Uraga that the isolation of Japan finally, violently ended. There, emerging from the summer mist, were 4 great, black, utterly alien ships, moving without sail, driven by the infernal power of coal and steam. They were cannons aimed directly at the heart of the Tokugawa Shogunate, and they were led by a man whose patience was as thin as his mandate was absolute, Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry. He had not come to ask for trade, he had come to demand it. And the shogunate had absolutely no defense against the future he carried. The sight of those vessels was a physical blow to the nation's psyche. It was not merely a military threat, it was a crisis of faith. For 2 centuries and a half, the Tokugawa peace had rested on a simple, absolute promise. Japan was safe. Safe from the outside. Safe from the chaos of the world. The arrival of the black ships was the moment that promise was irrevocably broken. Perry delivered his letter, a thinly veiled ultimatum disguised as a diplomatic request. Then, in a final, calculated insult to their pride, he withdrew. He left behind a terror deeper than any cannonball, the certainty that he would return, and that when he did, he would expect an answer. This moment, the summer of 1853, defines the shogunate's terminal illness. The military government, the Bakufu, was instantly paralyzed. Its leaders, men who had known only administrative peace, were utterly incapable of confronting this steam-powered menace. They knew only one thing: to agree was surrender, but to fight was suicide. In an act of political blasphemy, one that shattered the carefully constructed facade of their power, the shogun's senior council did the unthinkable. They asked for help. They solicited opinions from the regional lords, the very men whose power they had spent 200 years meticulously suppressing. This consultation was a poison pill. It was the first formal admission of weakness to the entire country, broadcast to ever. Why rival domain? The moment the shogun asked for advice, he gave away the fundamental claim to his authority, the claim of absolute military competence. The Iron Peace began to rust immediately. Perry returned the following year, not with 4 ships but with 8. The threat had doubled. The pressure was now unbearable. There was no longer a debate to be had, only an inescapable concession to be made. It culminated in the signing of the Treaty of Kanagawa. On March 31, 1854, the isolation of Japan was formally, permanently broken. It was an act of profound, generational humiliation that had been forced upon the nation at the point of a cannon. The treaty did not simply open 2 minor ports to American ships. It opened a deep, agonizing wound in the national soul that would never heal. The Tokugawa Shogunate, the greatest military power the nation had ever known, had failed the primary task of any warrior government, to defend the realm. They had buckled. They had caved to a foreign demand backed only by coal smoke and steel. From the ancient, simmering resentments of the outer domains, like Satsuma and Choshu, a new revolutionary dogma was instantly born. Sano joy, reverence for the emperor, expulsion of the barbarian. It was a rallying cry that seemed profoundly patriotic on the surface, but its true, dark intention was aimed squarely at Edo Castle. The barbarian to be expelled was no longer the American. It was the shogun himself. The immediate aftermath was a maelstrom of political violence. Men rose to power only to be assassinated a year later. The most important of these was Ieyasu, the shogunate's great reformer and hardliner. He dared to sign the foreign treaties, arguing for necessary, gradual modernization. His enemies saw only treason. His doom arrived on a snowy morning in 1860, outside the Sakuradaman gate of Edo Castle. Assassins struck. Ieyasu, the chief minister of the entire military government, was cut down like a common criminal. His corpse lay dead in the snow, a grim, silent herald of the inevitable. This was not merely a murder. This was a direct, violent declaration of war against the shogun's government. The political order was shattered. The struggle was no longer about treaties or ports. It was about survival. The Tokugawa dynasty was now openly, irrevocably bleeding. And in the powerful, distant southern domains, the samurai were sharpening their swords, preparing for the conflict that would end 300 years of peace and plunge the nation back into the terrible, cleansing fire of civil war. The blood of Ieyasu had barely melted into the snow when the real terror began. The assassins had succeeded in revealing the shogun's deepest vulnerability, the truth that the old law no longer offered protection to anyone. The message was simple and brutally clear. The state itself was failing. The Sano Joy movement now shifted its theater of operations from political conspiracy to open-air murder. Not only the shogun's ministers, but every foreign life in the treaty ports became a target. These were the years of the Hidakiri, the manslayers. Ronin, masterless samurai filled with nationalist fury and radical dogma, stalked the streets of Kyoto and Yokohama. It was a chaotic, violent pruning of the old order, driven by men who believed murder was the purest, fastest form of patriotism. The true capital of revolution was no longer the bureaucratic, controlled Edo, but the ancient, volatile city of Kyoto, where the emperor himself was held captive by history and now, by the very men claiming to fight in his name. The political energy of the nation was drawn inexorably toward the imperial palace, an irresistible vortex pulling against the entrenched power of the shogun. For decades, the 2 most powerful anti-Tokugawa domains, Satsuma in the deep south and Choshu in the west, had eyed each other with ancestral suspicion. Satsuma, pragmatic and reserved; Choshu, revolutionary and aggressively expansionist. They were rivals in every sense, yet the existential crisis facing the shogunate demanded a terrible unity. A handshake, conducted in secret by diplomats like Sakamoto Ryoma, secured what 3 centuries of Tokugawa isolation and prohibition had made impossible: the Sacho alliance. The architects of this union were a generation of men hardened by constant paranoia and political risk. On the Satsuma side, the colossus was Seigo Takamori, a man of simple manners and fearsome resolve, the very embodiment of the stoic samurai ideal. Opposite him stood Kaido Takeyoshi of Choshu, the brilliant strategist and ideologue, a mind dedicated to the dismantling of every old institution. Their combined will was the true dynamite beneath the shogunate's foundation. Cornered, humiliated, and hemorrhaging authority, the shogun's government chose a final, desperate gamble. They would not wait to be attacked. They would crush the root of the rebellion. The target was Choshu. The Second Choshu expedition was launched in 1866, a massive deployment of the shogun's finest troops. This was the moment the Tokugawa dynasty staked its entire legacy on the battlefield. But the armies that marched north were relics. They were samurai armed with spears and outdated matchlocks, commanded by men who had bought their titles rather than earned them in battle. The Choshu forces, however, had learned from the enemy. They were armed with modern Minié rifles and cannons, trained in European tactics, their morale forged in the fire of their own exclusion. The result was not a victory, it was an annihilation. The shogunate forces were routed, suffering a humiliating, irreparable defeat at the hands of a regional domain. The shogun's military reputation, the very foundation of its 3-century rule, was instantly evaporated. In the midst of this disaster, the young shogun, Ieyasu, died. He left behind a dynasty in tatters, its army disgraced. The immense weight of 300 years now fell onto the shoulders of Tokugawa Ieyasu, the last shogun. He was an intelligent, charismatic man, a true reformer, yet he had inherited a house on fire. He knew the war was no longer avoidable. The southern domains had tasted blood and victory. For them, retreat was an unthinkable betrayal of the emperor. The final order was given: mobilize the core Tokugawa armies. At the same moment, the Sacho alliance prepared for a march on Kyoto itself, demanding the emperor's final, damning decree to overthrow the military government. The two forces, one the dying legacy of feudalism, the other the brutal engine of the New World, began their slow, inevitable convergence. There would be no political solution, no treaty, and no peace. The fate of Japan was about to be decided on a winter battlefield, in a conflict that would forever be known as the Boshin War. The alliance did not simply march on Kyoto, they engineered a political detonation. On January 3, 1868, a chilling document was issued from the emperor's palace. It was the Edict of Imperial Restoration. It was not a request for change, it was an execution order. The Tokugawa Shogunate, the institution that had defined Japan for 268 years, was abolished. All lands, titles, and privileges were to be surrendered immediately. The new government was to be the emperor himself, restored to ancient, terrifying power. Yasunabu, the last shogun, could have struck first. His core forces were gathering near Osaka, hardened and ready to move. Yet he hesitated. He was a man who still clung to the notion of political resolution, believing a display of humility might somehow halt the avalanche. He announced he would defer to the emperor's will. But the Sacho alliance was not interested in deference. They wanted annihilation. They wanted a casus belli that would justify the use of their own modern arsenal. They began systematically provoking the Tokugawa's main force near the ancient river crossings of Toba and Fushimi, just south of Kyoto. The first shots were fired on the 27th of January. The shogunate army was a tragic tapestry of two worlds. There were spear-wielding samurai, clinging to the romantic ghost of feudal warfare, mixed with ranks of newly trained modern infantry. Facing them, the Sacho alliance stood as a single, hardened weapon of the future. Their modern rifles and superior artillery spoke a language the Tokugawa could not answer. It was a clash between two eras, and the old one bled out first. Yet the final blow was not forged in gunpowder, it was woven in silk. In the midst of the fighting, a single golden banner was suddenly raised by the alliance, the brocade banner of the emperor. Beside it, a retinue of imperial guards dressed in the forbidden colors. This was the moment of ultimate political warfare. The Sacho forces were no longer rebels, they were the emperor's army. The Tokugawa forces, for 3 centuries the emperor's protectors, were instantly branded traitors. For many domain loyalists and peripheral troops fighting for the shogun, this was an unimaginable horror. They had been fighting for order, for legitimacy, and now they stood condemned by heaven itself. Allegiances fractured. Men threw down their weapons or defected outright, turning their guns on their former allies. The morale of the shogunate line disintegrated. Within 4 days, the Tokugawa army was in full, panicked retreat toward Osaka. The retreat quickly became a rout. They left behind cannons, equipment, and hundreds of dead, scattered across the fields of Fushimi. In Osaka Castle, Yoshinobu watched the chaos unfold. His strategy of calculated humility had failed. His army was broken, his authority vanished. He had tried to be the wise statesman, the last reformer to save the old regime. Now he was simply the head of a doomed resistance. He made a decision that sealed the fate of his family and ignited a true civil war across the whole nation. Abandoning his army, leaving them without command, he slipped away in the dead of night, boarding his personal warship. He sailed toward Edo, the shogun's ancestral capital, leaving the field of battle and the wreckage of his dynasty behind. He fled the south, but the enemy did not pause. They would follow him, now armed with the total, terrifying mandate of the sun goddess herself. The war had just begun. The flight of the last shogun was not a retreat, it was an abandonment. When the Kaiyomaru steamed silently from Osaka Bay, it carried more than just a broken leader. It carried the final, definitive end of the Tokugawa age. Yoshinobu believed he was saving his family from the shame of capture. He believed he could still negotiate from his ancestral stronghold. But to the men he left bleeding in the fields of Fushimi, his exit was the ultimate betrayal. The samurai class had been abandoned by the shogun himself. The fragile concept of Tokugawa legitimacy dissolved completely. The new imperial army, now hardened veterans of battle and blessed by an ancient decree, did not hesitate. Their pursuit was less a military campaign and more a pilgrimage of righteous vengeance. North, toward the Kanto plain they marched, gathering speed and legitimacy with every passing mile. They were no longer domain loyalists. They were the vanguard of a new national order. They came not to compromise but to conquer. They demanded the head of the rebel Yoshinobu and the utter, immediate dissolution of the shogunate power structure. In Edo, the shogun's ancestral home, the news of the rout and the flight arrived as a creeping, suffocating dread. 300 years of peace had created a city of 1,000,000 souls, a vibrant, sprawling metropolis built on the iron foundation of Tokugawa law. Now, that foundation was dissolving into panic. The city was a ripe fruit waiting to fall. Its defenses were hollowed out by generations of complacency and the recent flight of its lord. The imperial forces would soon be at the gates of the magnificent Edo castle, the very symbol of the Tokugawa dynasty. The choice that faced the remaining loyalists was a nightmare. Fight and see the capital of the East reduced to ashes, or surrender and dismantle the entire political edifice that had defined Japan since the Battle of Sekigahara. Into this vacuum of terror and indecision stepped one man, Katsu Kaishu. He was the shogun's naval minister, a brilliant administrator, and a man who understood that history's demands often outweighed military pride. Katsu knew the war was lost, but he refused to let the city be the casualty. He saw the inevitable future of a unified nation and recognized that its birth should not be paid for in the blood of 1,000,000 innocents. Across the divide stood Seigo Takamori, the imperial field commander. Seigo was the stone fist of the new regime, stoic, ruthless, and absolutely dedicated to the emperor's mandate. For him, the destruction of Edo would be a regrettable necessity, but the cleansing fire needed to forge the new Japan. The military solution was the easiest and the cleanest. The two men, the last statesman of the old world and the architect of the new, agreed to a secret parley. Not on the battlefield, but in a small, quiet temple outside the city, They met to trade the fate of an entire civilization. The air was thick with the weight of unsaid threats. Seigo held the sword. Katsu held the surrender terms. Katsu did not plead for the shogun, he pleaded for the people. He argued not for loyalty but for legacy. He asked Seigo to spare the city's vast cultural treasure, its libraries, its temples, its populace, arguing that a true victory was not measured in smoke and rubble, but in the peaceful transition of power. He offered unconditional surrender, the shogun's final, total humiliation, the surrender of the castle itself. Seigo listened, his face an unreadable mask. He could take the city by force, earning eternal glory as the warrior who crushed the final enemy, or he could accept the surrender, sparing 1,000,000 lives but potentially leaving pockets of Tokugawa resistance untouched. The decision took hours. The entire history of the dynasty, 300 years of centralized power, now rested not on the flight of a shogun, but on the silent, chilling verdict of one man in a small, quiet room. If Seigo said no, the great city of Edo would burn. It was a dynasty built on a contradiction, the promise of eternal calm, bought with the currency of absolute control. For over 2.5 centuries, the Tokugawa Shogunate stood as an unmoving monument to one man's will. Theirs was a peace forged not by treaties or goodwill, but by iron discipline and the shadow of the sword. They silenced the civil wars, but in doing so, they also muted the nation's voice. Every village, every road, every samurai's loyalty was mapped, measured, and constrained by a meticulous be of law. The outside world was not merely restricted, it was systematically erased, sealed behind the policy of Sakoku. The great peace was thus a great cage. Yet within that cage something profound occurred. Freed from the relentless cycle of bloodshed, the Japanese soul turned inward. The samurai, their battlefield purpose removed, became administrators, poets, and philosophers. Culture flourished in quiet, exquisite detail. The world of the floating lantern, of kabuki, of meticulous woodblock prints, this was the unintended bounty of the shogun's order. But the world outside does not pause for a nation's reflection. The currents of global power are relentless, and stability, when prolonged, can become stagnation. When the black ships of the West finally arrived, breaking the 265-year silence, the paradox of the Tokugawa was laid bare. The peace that had saved Japan from itself had also left it utterly unprepared for the world that awaited. The dynasty fell, not in a blaze of glory, but with the quiet exhaustion of an idea whose time had passed. The enduring question remains: was the Iron Peace a necessary winter, allowing the seeds of a modern Japan to take root and wait for spring? Or was it merely a delay, a long, golden pause that left the nation sprinting to catch a future that had already left the harbor?